What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be covering projectiles in our fighting game tutorial series. So in this episode, we will be teaching you how to basically perform a command that we set up in code, or just set up that way it's added to our current character's list of commands, and we're going to be able to perform that command, play an animation, spawn a projectile, attach a hitbox to that projectile, and then do damage to the character upon collision, and of course destroy the projectile if it lands. So there's a bunch of different projectiles we can use. In this case we're going to be using a fireball because of course that makes the most sense, since a lot of people compare projectiles to Hadouken from Street Fighter. So yeah, anyway, that's what we're doing today. I'll show you how we do this. So for me, I've added a command that is A, B, and E to do it. Now remember, the keys don't matter. I make in certain things so I can remember, but on a controller, if you were doing this, you could do, bottom face button, left face button, right face button or something, and that's your command. So let's say we did that. Whoops, and I didn't do it fast enough. There we go. You can see it goes into an animation, spawns a fireball, the fireball hits the opponent takes damage, and then the fireball gets deleted. Also important to note, this can be done from either direction, and it will also rotate the actor so that it looks good from both directions. If it's not an asymmetrical shape or object, we'll rotate it so that it looks good either direction that you fire it. So there we go. The hitboxes that we spawn will also be pretty dynamic, so they will work the same way that our regular hitboxes do, in terms of you can modify them all within one function, and you can have as many as you'd like and have them with different values and variables. Okay, let's get into the code. There's pretty much nothing we're going to add in the code today. We're actually just going to go over making the command. So for those that have watched the command episode, this will probably be a little bit redundant, but I'm just showing you what I'm doing, and also kind of reminding you exactly how to use this, because it might have been a bit since you've used it, depending on when you followed the series and if you're following the episodes in order and things like that. So I'm just going to cover that real quick, and then we'll get into all the fireball logic. For those that have not seen the command and input tutorial, so doing a certain sequence of inputs to perform a specific command or action, then I will leave a link in the iCard in the top right corner right here to bring you to the command and input episode. And if you're interested in catching up on everything we've done in the fighting game tutorial series, we're on episode 42, so we're pretty far along. I can go ahead and send over the first episode in this iCard right here if you want to check out where we started and how we got to where we are now. Otherwise, let's go ahead and add our command. So every time you want to add a command, all we got to do, we've got this array of commands. Remember, it's a T array of of F commands. It's called character commands, and it's blueprint, read, write, edit anywhere. You'll see why I bring those up in a second. And then when you want to add a command to your character, you just go ahead and add 1 to the number of character commands. So before I only had 2, but now I want to add this fireball, so I'm going to make this set num 3. Then you just go through and set all the inputs. We set the name of the character command. So character commands 2, index 2, is the last index of character commands because it starts at 0. So index 2 is our fireball. We call the name fireball. We add the actual inputs to it, A, B, and E, and then has used command is false. It's false by default and will pretty much always be false by default. I can't really think of a great reason to make it true by default, but just as a sanity check, go ahead and set that to false. Okay, now that's simple enough, and that's actually all we're going to do in the code for right now. But the one thing that I did want to bring up, and this is the reason I said that it was edit anywhere in blueprint, read, write. While it's good that we can do that because we use it in the AnimBP to determine what animation we're using and things like that, it can cause a small issue, and it's easily fixable, but you do have to kind of be aware of what's going on. So whenever you edit code that's in a constructor, you see this. Whenever I edit code in a constructor, you have to make sure you're watching out, because if you edit something that's blueprint, read, write, that can be changed in the blueprint or changed on the character or object when you select it in the scene in the world. So for example, if I click on this guy, he's got all these things I can change. Anything in here and anything in the constructor, be careful. It's possible that you'll change them and they don't actually change. This is mainly for the reason that the constructor can sometimes be running while the editor is up and only run one time. It won't always run every time you start the game. So just take note, the reason I bring this up is it happened to me earlier. I learned a lot about this as I was trying to figure out what my issue was. But I was putting a breakpoint in my constructor when I was starting my game, and I couldn't get this other command to fire. And I'm like, what is going on? I swear I'm setting it up correctly. Well, I was setting it up correctly, but the way it was being edited in my character instance was not working. And what I mean by that, if I go into my mutant BP here, so he's got his details on the other side here. And I intentionally left this in. I'm going to remove them, but I intentionally left this in so you guys can see this. So remember I set it to a size of 3? Well, he got a size of 5 because I was playing around with the numbers, and at one point I added 5. So I was setting the index of 2 using the index of 4, which is the 5th element in the array. So I wasn't able to get my animation to play correctly. So just take note, if you're editing things in the constructor, specifically this, it is possible that since we made it blueprint, read, write, and edit anywhere, that you could have some issues if you played with this in the past or have to size down the array. I just wanted to make that very known because it took away some of my time trying to debug what was going on. So I left these in here so you guys could see them. They are empty, but they were filled out at one point for what I was doing, and they just never left because they were in my constructor. So if you really think you're doing everything right with your commands but it's not working, potentially go and check in your blueprint to see if you have a similar issue. But otherwise, we're good with the code. And we can also close the mutant character BP. We don't need it. We do need our mutant anim BP, and we will also need our projectile class. So let's go ahead and make a projectile. I put mine in functional BPs. Of course, the folder path does not matter. Just you can see that what I've actually used as the parent class is just actor as usual. So just go to new, add new, blueprint class, actor, and then once you click this, it'll ask you to name it. Call it whatever you want. I call mine default projectile. It is going to look like a fireball in my case, but again, you can put whatever you want. Okay, so once you get into your projectile, your default projectile class right here, I guess I should have called it default projectile BP or something to make it a little bit more clear, but whatever. Once you get into your default projectile class, you're going to see some logic in my event graph. We're not going to do that just yet. We're going to focus on some things in the viewport first. That way we know what we're working with. Now, by default, you'll have the default scene root, which is perfectly fine. You can keep that and we'll be good to go. But you want to also add, I've added a static mesh that is a cube, so I know where my collision is going to go, because I'm going to spawn a hitbox on it, but actually what I'm going to do is use this as my hitbox. You can always change this shape. If you wanted to, you could actually pass parameters in the function we're going to make in the animation blueprint to resize this object to the hitbox size that you want. But for now, since this is just a default projectile and I only want one size, I'm just going to use this cube itself as the actual size, and we will attach a hitbox that matches this size. Alright, so just hit add component and hit add static mesh. This is how you can get the cube. Call it whatever you want. You can keep it static mesh or whatever. So go down, select whatever static mesh you want. I kept mine as a cube just because it works for this projectile. You'll probably want to put either some sort of actual mask over it to actually hit where the effect hits, or shorten it a bit. It's pretty high. It would probably give off some bad readings. If someone tried to jump above it, it might be a little bit too big and they might get angry. So you might want to resize the cube itself using the scale here to make the projectile a little bit more fair. But regardless of that, I went ahead and disabled gravity. I don't really think it's necessary because we're going to disable gravity in this projectile movement component we have, which will handle a lot of that stuff. But it doesn't hurt to get rid of it anyway. Make sure the collision presets on your static mesh are set to overlap all, since that's how we're going to be doing the collision check. And I've also hidden it in game since I'm going to use the particle system as my actual visual for the projectile, as opposed to this cube. Then at the bottom, where you have your events, you can go to on component begin overlap and hit the little plus to add it, and it'll add it in here for you. I've got this going on. We're not going to go over that yet. We're going to finish up the stuff in the viewport and the components here, and then we'll get into that logic. Now, you can go ahead and add a particle system if you want. This part is not necessary. This is the part that we can actually make the projectile look like what we want. So this is our default projectile as well. This means we can use all other projectiles as a child of this class. So you don't even have to put particle system on it if you don't want. You can put on whatever you want. Since I'm going to be using a fireball and I wanted to show that off, I went ahead and added a particle system right here. And then just so you can see what settings I've put, I went ahead and added this pky_fireball particle system template to the particles section here. This is from the FX Variety Pack in the Unreal Marketplace. So if you're interested in checking that out, I will leave a link to the asset pack in the description. It's not mine, it's not from anyone I know, so I'm just passing the info along. I figured if I'm using their stuff, I might as well give them credit for it. Okay, so all I did was apply that and nothing else here, because again, this is just for the visual effect. You can go ahead and add an animation or some sort of other static mesh, or just particles of some other kind, like a particle effect, whatever you want to do, however you want to make it work. Then, this part's important. We're going to add a projectile movement component. So just type in projectile, and here it is. It'll get added separately. Once you create your projectile movement here, the information in here, we're not going to change a ton. We're going to change the gravity scale to make it 0. And then the other things that we're going to change, basically it's just going to be the velocity. We'll end up doing that in the code, and I realize this is actually a 1. I want all my velocities to be 0. I guess it's 1 by default, but I want them all to be 0. And we want our projectile gravity scale to be 0 as well. I mean, there will be projectiles where you might want gravity to be applied. In the case of this fireball, I don't, so I want it to be 0. So feel free to mess with this. There's a ton of stuff in here, and it can be very helpful to make different projectile types. Okay, let's go into our event graph real quick. There's two things we're going to need to do. So one is what happens when we collide with the actor that we're looking for, so our enemy. And then one is something I'm calling spawn projectile. It's a custom event I've made. It's the same way I've made the hitbox, spawn hitbox logic in our AnimBP, if you're familiar with that, if you've been watching the series. Okay, so if I go into my AnimBP, this is my mutant AnimBP. I'm just going to show you what I was talking about a second ago. In my create active hitbox, this is the hitbox that you guys will already have if you've been following the series. It's basically how I spawn the hitboxes and set all the values that we want for that specific hitbox. You'll see after I spawn actor, hitbox actor BP, I then call an event called spawn hitbox on that. This just basically waits, it creates the hitbox object, but it does not apply any of the damage or parameters that it has to the hitbox until I call this. We use this for a bunch of different reasons, so I'm not going to go into it now, especially if you've been watching the series, but I want to just let you know this is what I'm relating this back to. So spawn hitbox I have in create active hitbox. And then in the default projectile, I have spawn projectile, but it's the exact same idea. So go ahead and add a custom event in your default projectile. Add custom, whoops, if I could spell, add custom event, and click this. Call it whatever you want, again, minus spawn projectile. And what we're going to do is determine the velocity based on the direction we're facing. And that's how we're going to spawn the projectile. That's when we want to actually spawn it. Because right now, you saw that I set the velocity to be 0 on all 3 axes. Now, the velocity that you set, well, it'll depend on where what orientation your scene is in. For me, you can see Y is the left and right. This is the main menu, but all my levels use the same axis orientation. So you can see here that Y is my left to right. Thus, I want my velocity to be on the left to right axis, which is the Y axis. So I've went ahead and added a vector. So you just make a new variable, and then hit the little pill here, and then vector is right here. And it's basically just a 3-dimensional object, so you have X, Y, and Z on it. When you'll have to compile after you make it. Once you compile, you'll be able to set a default value. I've set it to be 800 because that's the speed of the projectile that I like. You can obviously change this to be whatever speed you want. And then this hit effect that I made is something additional, you can go ahead and add it now if you want. It's just a particle system. So add a new variable, click on the type again, and search for particle system, and then select an object reference. This is going to be the effect that happens when the projectile collides with an enemy. This could also be applied if it collides with some item in the scene, like if you have barrels you can throw at the opponent or something. You could also apply the effect here. Okay, so in our spawn projectile, remember this is what we're going to call when we're ready to actually create the projectile and get it moving. So we're going to get the owner of the projectile. So we'll be setting the owner when we spawn this class. And then we're going to go ahead and cast it to our fighter template character. Make sure that the owner of this projectile is one of our characters. Then, once it is, we get the isFlipped variable from that. So quite literally, type get owner, cast off of that, and do cast to fighter template character, whatever your default character is. Then drag off of this and do isFlipped. And this determines what direction we're facing. So if we're facing left or if we're facing right. Then we just do a branch off that, drag off isFlipped and do branch right here. And then you determine if it's true, we're going to set velocity and local space for the projectile movement component, or if it's false, we're going to do the same thing. But what changes is we're going to change the velocity we put in. So remember, our velocity is 800 on the Y, 0 on the X, 0 on the Z. So if we grab our projectile movement, and you can actually bring it onto the scene from this little section up here. Go ahead and say set velocity and set velocity in local space, this one right here. Then grab your velocity variable right here, and you can do a float multiply like that to determine what you want the scale to be. You can see up top, if the isFlip variable is true, I multiply by -1, which means the speed is the velocity is negative 800 on the Y. Otherwise, if we are not flipped, then the speed is 800 on the Y. Simple enough. So that's setting our speed. Then, in our onComponentBegin overlap that we created earlier when we hit the little plus on our static mesh, we want to do the logic for if we hit the opponent. Now there's a lot going on in this one, so let's go ahead and skip over to the mutant anim BP. That way this makes a lot more sense. So go into your mutant fireball or whatever. I called my mutant fireball, but if you have an animation where you want to spawn the fireball, then go ahead and go into that animation and make an anim notify at the frame you want the projectile to be spawned. So just go into your animation, right click on the frame you want, add notify, new notify, and then you can call it whatever you want. I called mine spawn fireball. You can now go back into your mutant anim BP, or again whatever character you're using, right click, and then search for anim notify _ spawn fireball. Now you'll have two. There's one that's the call function, and then the other one's the event. So as always, whoops, if I could type, we want the event. And you can see I've already set that up here. Okay. Now, in the logic for when the spawn fireball event is called, we want to go ahead and spawn our actor and then pass the projectile hitbox data to the projectile, and then call the spawn projectile function that we made in the default projectile. That's this, where we were setting the velocity. We're going to go ahead and call that after we create the hitbox and attach it, and after we spawn the projectile. So, right click and do spawn actor from class, this one right here, and then go to the class and select the default projectile. If you've been following the series, you'll already have a player transform. Just go ahead and drag player transform into the scene, get it, and then put it into the spawn transform for the projectile. We want to spawn at the center. You might want to put an offset if you're not too happy with the projectile spawning at the center of the character, such as if they have a gun or a bow. You don't necessarily want it to spawn at the center of their body. And then this might be closed by default. You have a little arrow. So if it only says instigator, open it up. Just hit this little arrow at the bottom here. And what you can do is you'll see this owner node, which is how we're going to determine who the owner is, so we know that we don't do damage to ourselves if we run into our own projectile. Go ahead and grab your mutant character reference, which is just a literal reference to my mutant character class, which is essentially the owner of this NMBP, and just set that as the owner of the default projectile. For those that aren't familiar with the series, if you don't want to watch the rest, in my blueprint update animation, I'm getting the pawn owner, getting the actor transform, and setting that as the player transform. That's how you can get this transform. Okay, now we need another function called create projectile hitbox. I've went ahead and added a bunch of stuff to it, but you'll see this is very, very similar to the create active and create proximity hitbox. It has all the same variables of damage, hit stun, block stun, pushback, and launch. I don't actually have an offset in here, but there's nothing wrong with the offset. It's just the offset is a little bit different here because I don't need a Y offset. I am creating a projectile. If I was going to offset, I would probably offset at the player transform. However, it doesn't really matter how you do it. You may want a Z offset because Z is my up and down axis here. You may want that so some projectiles spawn higher or spawn lower. So feel free to add that. Okay. Now in our create projectile hitbox, as always, make a new function, just hit plus function. It'll open it up automatically and call it whatever you want. I called mine create projectile hitbox. Now, if you're familiar with the other hitbox functions, it's basically the same thing. What we're going to do is have all these variables that the user can assign. So click on your function. You may need to compile and save before you can do this. Go down to your inputs, and we're going to add all these inputs. So we're going to add one for projectile reference, one for type, one for damage, one for hit stun time, one for block stun time, one for pushback distance, and one for launch distance. There's a very good chance you don't need launch distance for your projectile. I'm not going to use it in this case, but there's also a very good chance that you will want it. So I figured I'd add everything as a possibility here. The good thing is we can still use our spawn hitbox or our hitbox actor BP for this. We don't need to make a specific projectile hitbox. You can if you'd like. In fact, it'd probably be a pretty good idea, but I didn't have any reason to actually split up the enum like that. So I figured I would just keep it as a strike hitbox. So you can see I've put in my projectile reference is my actor that I spawned previously in the anim notify. It goes right into the projectile reference. Then I put it as a strike hitbox, deal 25 damage, 0.3 as hit stun and block stun time, pushback distance of 100, and launch distance of 0. And all I do is I grab the projectile reference and get actor transform off of it. So literally drag off and get actor transform. Like this. Then I use that to where I want to spawn the hitbox actor. So spawn actor from class, just like we were doing in the create active hitbox, and spawn your hitbox actor, BP. Just like that. And then drag in your get actor transform to the spawn transform. Then we can do something called attach to actor, which means as this projectile is moving, the hitbox will also be moving with the projectile. The way you do this, you can type in attach to actor and either unclick context sensitive and grab this one right here. Make sure the target is actor. Or you can drag off of your projectile reference, say attach to actor, and select this one right here with context sensitive clicked. So there you go. Either way, get this value, get this node, drag in, and if you did the latter method, then projectile reference will already be brought into the parent actor. That's the one that is you want the child to be following. So we want the hitbox to be following the projectile. So the parent is the projectile, so bring that into parent actor. Then the actor we spawn, the hitbox actor BP, is the target, so bring that into target. We don't need a socket name in this case because we're just attaching it as a whole to the object. In the location role, I have it as snap to target. You can do others. There are reasons for them. I'm not going to go over them now. Basically, snap to target will always ensure that the hitbox is right along with the projectile, which is what we want. Okay, then, as usual, I have the same method going on here where I bring my hitbox actor BP reference. You can see this is the blue line right here. And I'm going to set all my variables. So I'm going to try get pawn owner and set owner. So literally try get pawn owner. What this is this is actually my mutant character. This is how we can tell who's dealing the damage. This will be helpful if you want to keep score or things down the line, because sure, we do the logic to determine if it's our projectile, and that way we don't hurt ourselves when we spawn it, but you want to know who the owner is. That way when you set the owner, then you know who's dealing the damage. This will also help with combos and things like that down the line. So after you've done try and get pawn owner, remember this blue line is the hitbox actor BP. Drag off of this and hit set owner, because we're setting the owner of the hitbox actor to be the try get pawn owner right here. Okay. Lastly, what we're doing in this function is setting our hitbox data. So all I'm doing here is bringing the values that were assigned in the input parameters here to the values of the hitbox itself. So hitbox type gets the hitbox type. Damage gets the hitbox damage. I'm trying to show you the whole line. And then you can see hit stun time, block stun time, pushback distance, launch distance all go under these 4 nodes. You can follow the lines. You have hit stun time, block stun time, pushback distance, launch distance. Remember that you'll need to drag off of your hitbox actor to be able to access any of these variables the way we're using it in the series. The hitbox itself has the data. So we drag off of our hitbox actor BP, get hitbox damage, and then, or set hitbox damage, excuse me, set hit stun time, set block stun time, set pushback distance, set launch distance. Then, lastly, we drag off the hitbox actor BP one more time and type spawn hitbox. Then I still add to the active hitboxes, but since the projectile doesn't have any sort of proximity hitboxes, I don't have to clear anything else up with that. So just grab your active hitboxes variable, hit add, and then go ahead and add your hitbox actor BP. There you go. And now we've successfully created our projectile hitbox. Remember, if we want it to be able to move, remember we have to call our spawn projectile function and give it velocity. So drag off of your default projectile right here. You can see I brought it down below, and type spawn projectile. And you're good to go. Now, once you've called that, you'll be able to have a projectile with velocity. You'll still need to set it up in your state machine if you'd like to be able to spawn it and actually perform this animation that will trigger the anim notify. It's going to be the exact same way I've done all the other commands, so I won't go into it in too much depth, but just to be safe and just to remember everything, make a new state, right click and hit add state. Name it whatever you want. I called it command 3 fireball. Click on idle to command 3. Well, drag off of idle or whatever state you want to be able to do it from, and then drag from that state back to idle or whatever state you want to return to when it's done. Then in idle to command 3, which is fireball, so your fireball animation, make sure the rules for it are to, if the command has used command boolean is true. So remember we set up our commands earlier in code and we said, hey, fireball is this one, A, B, and E. Well, once that gets found when we're parsing through the input stack, we set the has used command to be true. So once this is true, we can go to that command and go to that animation. Then in the animation itself, we have the mutant fireball animation. I actually have it set to loop, which I shouldn't. It doesn't matter because it's returning to idle anyway. But just to be safe, I'm going to undo that. Then I want to drag from command 3 fireball back to idle, and all I do, I don't have any specific transition rules. I just click automatic rule based on sequence player in state. I've said it so many times that I know what it says now. Lastly, make sure you set your events as usual. So in your notifications tab at the bottom of your transitions, when we're performing a projectile, we still want to call start attack transition because we still want to make sure that we can stop the player from moving when they're doing an attack and things like that. Or else we want to clean up hitboxes when we do this. So make sure you still call start attack transition on start transition event, And on command back to idle, we call end command transition. Remember, we have to do end command transition instead of end attack transition, because when we end the command, we set the command values back to their default, such as fireball getting set back to false. And this has all been covered in other episodes, so I'm not just going through this willy-nilly, but I just wanted to remind everyone while you're doing this is how the system is set up. Also important to know, I did make one small change in the right here. In one of the previous episodes, I changed the way that this works to have clear hitboxes as its own function, which was good. The issue was I actually put mutant character reference can move being set to true at the end of this, which was bad because I was bringing end jump transition, end attack transition, and start attack transition into this logic. When we're starting attack, we don't want to be able to move. So only on end jump and end attack does can move become true. Start attack transition skips that node. Very tiny difference, but if you're following the series completely, then I figured I would point it out for you guys. Alright, now we have our animation actually being able to be played in the animation state machine. We have the anim notify getting hit when that animation is played, which spawns the projectile and gives it velocity. All we need to do is determine what happens when it collides with an enemy, and how to determine when it collides with an enemy. So go back into your default projectile class, or your blueprint in this case. And remember we did this on component begin overlap, which I said was a bit complicated. Well, here's how we're going to figure this out. So drag off of the other actor. So on component begin overlap it refers to this actor, which is the default projectile, colliding with another actor and overlapping with them. So the other actor is not the projectile. It's the character or the other object it's colliding with. We're hoping it's a character. So then we want to go ahead and drag off the other actor and cast to see if it's someone we can damage. Or again, you might want to have barrels or environment objects that you can also damage. You can look for them as well. We're going to cast to our fighter template character because that's our base character. Then we're going to say get owner. Now remember, we set our owner in the anim BP right here. So we know that our owner is this character reference, this mutant character. So if the owner, what you can do is drag off of the cast and say exclamation mark equals or type not equal. Either way works. Then bring in the owner. So if the actor we're colliding with is not equal to the owner of this projectile, then we can continue. Otherwise, we stop right there. So drag off of the not equal and do a branch. And only continue if this is true. Only continue if the actor we're colliding with is not the owner of this projectile. Then we're going to figure out what the hitbox actor data is. So we can do something called get attached actors. You can attach as many actors as you want, and all we're attaching is the projectile, remember. In here we call it attach to actor. So this is an attached actor. So, whoops. If we get attached actors and get 0, because we're only ever attaching one thing to this projectile, and it is the hitbox, then we know this return node is the hitbox actor we attached earlier. So we have to cast it to the hitbox actor so we can get the variables that it has. And you can see I've done that right here. I'm going to delete these. And then I get all the nodes that I could potentially want. So what I'm doing is I'm calling take damage on the other actor that we're colliding with. Remember, other actor. We cast it here. We saw that it wasn't equal to our owner. I also brought a line down below. It's this line all the way at the bottom you see. And I brought it over here and called take damage. Then I filled out all of these variables with the variables in the hitbox actor BP. So take damage looks for damage amount, hit stun time, block stun time, pushback amount, and launch amount. So drag off of this and look for hitbox damage. Then look for pushback distance, launch distance, hit stun time, and block stun time. Once you get all 5 of those, you can drag them directly into take damage. And then this as a little bit of an additional effect. If we've collided, we're going to play a effect to show that we've collided with an object, or in this case our other actor, and then we're going to destroy the actor. Now, quick note, right now there's nothing destroying the projectile over time. as there should be. So if you launch this, you can launch it into oblivion and it won't matter. What you should really do is give it a certain amount of life, and once the life runs out, then the projectile gets despawned, or once it goes off the map, it gets despawned. We'll actually go over some cleaning up techniques with that later, so don't worry, I'm not leaving it out intentionally. It will be covered later in the series, but this episode's already long, so I wanted to get to it later. Now, what we want to do after there's been a collision of some sort is we want to play an effect. So remember, I mentioned this hit effect particle system earlier? Well, all I did was add this as the default value. Again, this isn't mine. This PKY explosion is part of the FX variety pack, but I'm using it here as the default value for this effect. All we do is drag our effect onto the screen, get hit effect, then drag off of that and call spawn, emitter at location. We don't really care about the rotation or the scale in this case. You can feel free to change them, but for me, I just wanted to display the effect at the location of the actor. So I get actor location, bring it into the location of the spawn emitter at location. As you can see, I've done above. I'm going to delete these, and then I just destroy the entire projectile on collision. And then once all that's done, you can see it come together. We can spawn our two characters, and here we go. So now I should be able to do ABE and use a fireball that direction. It will explode. I can go around on the other side, use a fireball, use a fireball this direction, and it will explode when it collides with him. You can see his health, pushback, launch, hit stun, block stun is all working as well. So now you've successfully made projectiles that have hitboxes that have easily changeable data and functionality. Whew. Well, there you go, guys. Thank you so much for watching this episode. If this video helped you or you enjoyed, please subscribe. It does more for me than anything else you can do for the channel. I just really appreciate it. Lets me know that I'm doing a good job in teaching you how to do the things you want to do in your game. If you had issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to contact me on Discord. Join the Discord community and we'll be able to help you out with pictures and videos, which will be a lot easier than YouTube comments. But feel free to also use the YouTube comments. No problems there. If you want to come support me on Twitch, I've been playing some Dark Souls 2. We actually just finished the last DLC and we're about to go fight the final boss of that game and get very excited to play some Demon's Souls. We're also playing Resident Evil 7 on Madhouse difficulty, which is a ton of fun right now. We're about to finish that as well, actually. The run has been going surprisingly well so far. Lastly, guys, if you'd like to come support us on Patreon, it's all set up and running. I said this last episode, but it's true. It's new. I've added some tiers to it, so feel free to go check it out and give me some support. Nothing is getting locked behind the Patreon, but there will be additional benefits if you subscribe to the tiers. So no worries there. Just figured I'd let you know and put it out there. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode. I'm going to go get some water because I'm very thirsty after saying all that. I said it about as quickly as I could. So thank you guys so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.